Susan Merdinger. I'm a Steinway artist and performer, and I'm here today to share with you a very, very special topic about the Dybbuk. And this all came about through my wonderful and dear association with the composer Ilya Levinson, who wrote a trio called the Dybbuk Piano Trio, dedicated to me. I had the very good fortune of premiering this work, and I'm looking forward to performing it many more times throughout my lifetime. This trio led me to start thinking about Dybbuks and spirits and ghosts, and I created a whole program based on a ghost theme, including Ludwig van Beethoven's Ghost Piano Trio and William Bolcom's Graceful Ghost Rag, as well as Morton Gould's Ghost Waltzes. So as you can see, over time, the theme about ghosts is ever present in our society and is one based on religious belief and spirituality. So today, I'm here because of a very special reason, that fate brought us together, Karen Kaplan and myself, on a fateful walk that I was taking here in Highland Park. And we both agree that it was kind of what is known in Yiddish beshert, that we met each other because when I was introduced to her as we were walking with a mutual friend, I was walking with a mutual friend of the two of us, she wasn't really supposed to be there at that time, so it was just really fate and luck. And we got to talking, and she told me about her new book that she had just written, her memoir, the one that she will introduce and discuss. So what you're about to hear is a presentation of Karen's book, Conjoined. I read it myself, and it brought tears to my eyes. This is a tale of searching and research, coming to terms with death, questioning, and reevaluating one's own religious beliefs, understanding life and people, and ultimately, this is a story of forgiveness, healing, and hope. I am very, very grateful that I met Karen, because reading her book was very insightful for me as someone who's lost a parent. And I believe that this will be a story that will be very helpful for many people to hear and to relate to their own experiences. And later, we will also meet with the composer Ilya Levinson to hear about his concept of the Dybbuk Piano Trio, which was an incredible experience for me to learn and a great joy for me to share with you. So here you will now hear a story by Karen Kaplan, who's the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, and hear a real-life story about a 20th century Dybbuk. And thank you, Karen, for sharing your story with me, with Ilya, and now the world. And I hope that all of you will take the time to listen to her story, read her book, and enjoy the story behind the music of the Dybbuk Piano Trio, which happens to be based on an entirely different Dybbuk, a different spirit, and a different story. And I will let Ilya Levinson tell you about that. For now, please enjoy Karen Kaplan's presentation on Conjoined. I'm just delighted to be here today with two fantastic, beautiful, wonderful people and musicians. To my right, I have Alex Kaufman on violin. He's the renowned violinist of the Maxwell Street Klezmer Band and the Rothstein Orchestra, and he is a much beloved performer in the Chicago area, and a composer and arranger himself, and also a collaborator with Ilya Levinson on numerous projects, as I am as well. And to my left, I have the amazing Martine Benman, wonderful cellist who hails from France and Russia and happens to be married to the composer that we will be featuring today, Ilya Levinson. And they have a wonderful musical family with 2 sons who are also musicians, so we've become wonderful friends. So it's my great pleasure to perform today these piano trios for you. And now we have Billy Levinson, his Dybbuk Trio. So when he presented this trio to me, I said, wouldn't it be cool if we had a whole entire ghost-themed concert? And so we decided to program for you today Beethoven's Opus 70 number 1, the Ghost Trio. And I think you'll hear certain similarities and certainly a lot of differences in these 2 works that are separated by several hundred years. But I think it will help us all to reflect upon the human spirit and how we exist, not just in our corporeal form, but also in the metaphysical realm. Ludwig van Beethoven's Opus 70 piano trios were written for piano, violin, and cello in 1808 and published in 1809. The first in D major, known as The Ghost, is one of his best-known works in the genre, rivaled only by the Archduke Trio. The D major trio features themes found in the second movement of Beethoven's Symphony No. 2. Beethoven was fond of reusing some of his themes that were very successful. Because of its strangely scored and undeniably eerie-sounding slow movement, it was dubbed the Ghost Trio. The ghostly music may have had its roots in sketches for a Macbeth opera that Beethoven was contemplating at the time. However, according to Louis Lockwood, one of Beethoven's biographers, Beethoven's pupil Carl Czerny wrote in 1842 that the slow movement reminded him of the ghost scene at the opening of Shakespeare's Hamlet, and this was the origin of the nickname. The Opus 70 are representative of Beethoven's middle stylistic period, which included many of his most famous works. He wrote the 2 piano trios while spending the summer of 1808 back once again in Heiligenstadt, Vienna, where he had completed his Symphony No. 5 the previous summer. This was also the location where he penned the famous Heiligenstadt Testament, a letter written by Beethoven to his brothers Karl and Johann in 1802. It reflects his despair over his increasing deafness, even his contemplation of suicide, and yet his continued desire to overcome his physical and emotional ailments to complete his artistic destiny. Since Beethoven's middle and late periods are generally forward-looking to the Romantic era, it comes as no surprise that his works took on a more romantic programmatic associations, as in the Pastoral Symphony No. 6, or his Appassionata Sonata Opus 57, or his Les Adieux Piano Sonata Opus 81A, and this certainly applies here to the Ghost Trio. requests. And what you just heard was the Ghost Trio of Ludwig van Beethoven, Opus 70, number 1. And now we'll do a little interlude. Of continuing with the ghost theme. I will play the Graceful Ghost Rag by William Balcom. works have continued to inspire composers through to the present day, and we certainly can see and hear the influence of Beethoven in Ilya Levinson's Dybbuk Piano Trio, amongst many other influences, of course. Nonetheless, Levinson's Dybbuk Piano Trio bears the stamp of an original, gifted composer, and I'm sure you will be thrilled to hear this world premiere. You should note some of the same pianistic techniques utilizing tremolos, lots of pedal, and eerie, otherworldly sounds emanating from all three instruments, much in the same way that Beethoven does in the slow movement of his Ghost Trio. Levinson's piano trio was similarly based on a literary form, a play by S. Ansky, which was later made into a movie and also a ballet. One can trace the structure of Levinson's trio to the scenes in this movie. Many distinguished composers, such as Leonard Bernstein, Morton Gould, William Bolcom, have composed music based on ghosts and dybbuks, and this piano trio is a wonderful addition to the contemporary classical music literature. Ilya Levinson has dedicated this piano trio to me, and I am delighted to perform it for you alongside violinist Alex Kaufman and cellist Martine Benman.
means to arrive at the point where composers are dedicating writing music for you. This is such a privilege and a distinct honor to be honored with this present. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Karen Kaplan, and I'm the author of my latest memoir called Conjoined, a Holocaust Haunting, One Man, Two Hearts, and Me. I'm going to be sharing some memorable stories along with some unusual encounters with a Dybbuk. What is a Dybbuk? It's a Yiddish word which means a malevolent spirit. Hundreds of years ago, the rabbis believed that these wandering spirits or souls were caught between two worlds, the world of the living and the world of the dead. As these souls would migrate through the realms, they would be in search of a host, preferably a live human body, and they would merge and attach themselves to the body, thus becoming an emotional parasite. Now, back then, if a rabbi would suspect that someone in their community indeed had an entity attachment or a Dybbuk, they would bring the person into their synagogue, and amongst 10 men, they would try to exorcise the Dybbuk. Even to this day, there are a few rabbis worldwide that will perform an exorcism. My story is based on my experiences. Some of you may believe this is pure fantasy, and some of you may believe this is reality. Either way, sit back, relax, and welcome to this unimaginable world. My story begins 100 years ago in Poland, on the peninsula shores of Lake Vygotsky, surrounded by the red marshes and green vegetation. One will see the fishermen catching whiting and eel and carp, and surrounding them are the wild birds wading in the blue serene waters of the lake. Behind the lake are the ancient primeval forests of northeastern Poland. Nestled between the lake and the forest is a shtetl, a small village called Rygród, meaning the city of paradise. My father, Avram Yankel Steinsapier, was born in Rygród in 1921. With his father, Chaim Shlomo, and his mother, Bela, and his 4 sisters and 1 baby brother, they lived in a 2-story home facing the town square in Rygród. About a mile and a half down the road, the Steinsapiers also owned a duck farm. My father spoke Yiddish in the house and Polish in the community, and he learned Hebrew from the town rabbi. They were raised in a traditional Orthodox home in Rygród. When my father was a little boy, his father passed away, and soon after, his baby brother died. So my grandmother, Bela, was left to tend to the farm, and she hired 2 local workers to help her out. My father's life in Rygród, as well as the Jews of Rygród, their life was fairly good, very prosperous. After all, my father's family, the Steinsapiers, lived in Poland for well over 200 years, owning land But here's where the story turns dark. It was June 22nd, 1941, almost 2 years into World War II. The Nazis invaded Rygród. The 2 men that worked on my grandmother's farm, under the guise of the Nazi officers, forced their way into my father's home, where they grabbed his mother and sisters and dragged them outside. Now, my father witnessed this horrific event from a hiding place. He heard his mother scream and plead, "Please, please, "Have mercy on me. Kill me quickly." And those men tortured and murdered his family. My father was traumatized, paralyzed from this event. He ran into the forests of Rygrude, further into the forest of Eastern Europe, and he never looked back, and he never went home. As to the fate of the Jews of Rygrude, well, 100 of them were forced to march on that day, 4 by 4, down the main streets of Rygrude into the forest, where they were all shot to death. The remaining Jews were forced in a ghetto, and then eventually they were sent to Treblinka, where they were all gassed to death, along with the rest of my father's family. My father spent 3.5 years in those forests trying to survive the war. When the war was over in 1945, he spent 5 years as a refugee in Germany. He made his way in 1950 to the United States and eventually moved to Chicago. By 1954, he had already met my mother and they married. I am the youngest of 2 older brothers. When I was a little girl, I realized that my father was a bit off and a bit different. I was scared of him, and I started to dislike him. When I became a teenager, I noticed when I was at my friends' homes that their fathers treated them so differently. They actually wanted to be with them and talk to them, and they seemed to love them. I always wanted love and respect from my father. I'd hoped for that, but my anger toward my father just, it's like his anger, my anger just exploded too. I became angry and didn't realize that I had actually kept a lot of this resentment and bitterness inside of me. In my teens, I had discovered that my father had used the alias Ari Kaplan. And I asked him one day, I said, "Daddy, why did you change your name?" And he looked at me sternly and he pointed his index finger and he said, in his Polish accent, "I changed my name to save my life. I found an ID during the war. Don't ever bring up the subject again." I never did, at least not with my father. As I continued to grow and I was a young woman and married with 3 loving children, I sensed that there had to be more, and I was unhappy in my marriage, and I was raised as an Orthodox Jew, and as I kept adhering to all these Orthodox laws, I was feeling suppressed and not spiritually uplifted. Then, in 1991, my brother Howard, who was an Orthodox rabbi, he passed away unexpectedly in his sleep. And my mother died 6 years later at the age of 62, and my world fell apart. I noticed I was depressed and sad, and though I loved my children, I wasn't happy. And in my book, I shared my spiritual journey and how I was able to empower myself and try to move forward. And I divorced and let go of some of the rules that were not spiritually uplifting for me. And yet I still wasn't happy. I started to ask the questions, why am I here? What is life all about? What is my purpose? I met this woman named Lee, who was a psychotherapist. She was also a spiritual teacher. She was a medium as well, and so she can connect to the souls that have departed. And she was a channeler. She can channel information from angels and spirits on the other side and provide her clients with messages. I knew I needed help, and I decided that I'm going to work with Lee. During my very first session with her, during my first session with her, she noticed my core issue. And she said to me, Karen, just as your father has been holding on to decades of this anger and bitterness and carrying the pain of his past, you too are following in his footsteps. It's time to let go. I said, what do you mean? She said, you are carrying all this bitterness toward your father. It's affecting your life. It affected your childhood. Now it's affecting your life and the people around you. You need to let go and you need to forgive your father. I explained to her that I grew up learning from my rabbis in school. They were my teachers, and they explained that a Jew doesn't forgive another Jew or anyone else unless they ask. And I explained that my father would never ask me for forgiveness, and he certainly didn't believe he did anything wrong, and if he did punish us, we deserved it. So why would I forgive my father? And Lee explained over the next several months that forgiveness helps the victim, not the perpetrator. The perpetrator has moved on. They may have forgotten what they've done to the victim. It's about letting go of the pain of your past, healing, so that you can move forward and live in peace and live with joy in your heart. After several months, I finally understood her definition of forgiveness. And I said, what next? And she said, now it's time to think back on your childhood and think about the moments where you felt unloved and unwanted. And so for the next couple of years, I started to remember many of the horrible stories that I endured as a child. I started to cry and let go of a lot of this anger and sadness and disappointment, and I cried a lot, mostly in the shower so my children couldn't hear me. At the end of the 2 years, I had no more tears left to shed. At this time, my father was rushed to the ICU at a hospital in Highland Park. Every day I came to visit him, I sat in the corner of his room while he was on the ventilator, and he was in a comatose-like state. He wasn't moving his eyes or fingers or toes. On the 7th day, as I stood outside his room, donning the mask and gown and gloves, I overheard the doctor in his room talk to the nurse, and he said, I can't believe this man is still alive. At that point, we had decided to remove my father from the ventilator. I quickly walked into the room and said, Doctor, please don't talk this way in front of my father. He is a Holocaust survivor. And the doctor understood, and the nurse and him had left the room. I sat in the corner again like I'd done previously, and all of a sudden something changed. My heart had started to swell with some compassion for my father. I've never felt this way toward him before. So I stood up and walked toward him and sat on the side of his bed, and I took his hand. It was filled with fluid. His organs were obviously shutting down. His arms were bruised because of the IV being pricked and prodded, and his bones were protruding from near his shoulder. I brushed the bangs off of his forehead, and I noticed 2 vertical grooves. He seemed like he was in pain. And I said to my father, I said, Daddy, it's time to let go. You've suffered your entire life. You don't have to suffer in death. Your father, Chaim Shlomo, your mother, Bela, your sisters, your baby brother, they're all waiting for you. Daddy, let go. And I started to weep. I looked at my father again and I said, Daddy, I want you to know that I truly forgive you. And I started to whisper the words, I forgive you, I forgive you. And I continued to cry. I looked up at him and all of a sudden I was startled. His eyes popped wide open and I moved to the right and he tracked me. I moved to the left and he followed me once again. And I thought, is my father cheating death one more time? I ran out and beckoned for the nurse. We came back to the room and his eyes were closed once again. At that time, I didn't know if my father heard me or if he understood me or if he agreed with what I was saying. But what I do know is, just a few days later, I had buried my father with a compassionate, forgiving, and loving heart. I finally felt free. It's as if all this weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I felt at peace. Then I decided that I would write a book called Descendants of Rygrudd, Learning to Forgive. And I was speaking throughout the Chicagoland area, New York, and I made my way to Germany and Poland. One day, a gentleman in the audience stood up and asked, he said, Karen, you've shared all this information about the lineage of your Stein-Sapir family, but who is this man, Ari Kaplan? And then I wondered, who is this stranger whose name I inherited? Then I began my research. For 6 months, I went online trying to track any information about a man named Ari Kaplan who was a similar age range as my father, who was born in Europe somewhere. I exhausted all possibilities and came to a dead end. So one day I decided to call up Lee and said, Lee, can you maybe find some information from the spirit world? Maybe you can tell me where I can do some research in Europe. Maybe there's an institution or genealogical society. And she said to me, Karen, why don't we just conjure up the spirit of this man? And I said, but I don't know if he's dead. After all, I spent a few sessions with Lee and I was able to speak to my mother and my brother in spirit. But Lee said it didn't make a difference if he was dead or alive. And then I said to her, but I've never met him. How would he know to come forward? How would I know you're talking to the right person? And she said, well, let's give this a try. My very first session with Lee, she began with a prayer of thankfulness and a prayer of protection, and she conjured up a man, a spirit named Ari Kaplan. As he called himself, Aryeh Kaplan. His name was spelled a bit differently. He began to speak through Lee and said, I am Polish. I was born in a small town. My father, Joseph Kaplan, was a Jew of German descent. My mother, Henrietta, was Greek Orthodox. We were raised in a small town where my father was mayor for 2 terms. Eventually, we moved to Rygrudd, and my father had opened up a store in 1914. I got all excited. If this man, this spirit, lived in Rygrudd, he surely must have known my father. He said he didn't know him. He said he wasn't sure if his parents knew him. And I thought that was odd because all Jews knew each other in these small shtetls. I asked him, well, where was the store you had mentioned that your father had sold supplies and food to everyone in Rygrudd? He said, well, the store was located across the street of the train station. And I said, Lee, this doesn't make sense. I've been to Rygrudd twice. I'm 99% certain there is no train station in there. And she said, I'm seeing a train station with the name Rygrudd on it. I said, well, what about the town church? There's this Catholic church that looms over every building in Rygrudd. You can see it from across the lake. Lee said, he doesn't remember a church. So I said, Lee, I'm not sure who you're talking to, but the story doesn't make sense. Can we end the session? And we did, and she said, Karen, I know what I've seen and I know what I've heard, and You'll make some sense out of this. I'm sure you will. For 3 weeks, I was on the internet digging some information about train stations heading either from Warsaw or Białystok, the main city in northeastern Poland, that led to Rygród. No stations went to Rygród. They veered to the north or they veered to the west. Then I thought, well, maybe the tracks were bombed during World War II and they were rerouted. Then I looked up the Catholic Church and discovered it was erected by 1908, long before his father, R.A. Kaplan's father, built that store in 1914. At the end of 3 weeks, I decided to type the word Rygród train station, and lo and behold, I saw a picture on the internet of an old station with the name Rygród and a 4-car passenger train standing in front. How could this be, I thought? Then I discovered that in Poland there are only 2 towns with the name of Rygród. The town that the spirit R.A. Kaplan came from was from central western Poland. Now I knew I had to talk to this spirit once again. I had several more sessions with Lee. He was able to shed light on my father's childhood, my father's life during the war, how he survived the war. But I wanted to know how he met my father or how my father attained his ID. And he said to me, I was a young soldier. I was conscripted into the army. Though I was born with a club foot, I never thought I would go in the army. But if I didn't go, they would send my family to Auschwitz. And I was confused. I said, are you talking about the Polish army? He said, no. He said, I was conscripted into the Wehrmacht, the German army. I said, you're a Nazi? He said, I was forced as a slave soldier, and I was treated and abused so badly by the German soldiers. After a year and a half, tying up prisoners at Auschwitz, Jews and Catholic priests and political figures, I decided to go AWOL. I ran into the forest, but I wasn't prepared. For 3 days and 3 nights, I kept running and running from those German shepherd dogs, all those guard dogs. On the 3rd night, the temperature dropped. The winds were howling and started to sleet and hail. I tripped over a rock. I hit my head and I had a broken skull and broke my leg, and I died that night of hypothermia and starvation. In the morning, your father, who's been living in the woods, came upon my body. He flipped me over and he started ransacking my clothes, and I started pushing and shoving and boxing him, and I wanted him to leave me alone. He didn't hear me. He didn't feel me. He didn't notice that anyone was there except for this body. He grabbed my knife and he opened up a pouch that I had, which had my identification in it. He took my uniform, and I put 2 and 2 together and realized that I had died and my soul hovered over my body. And just like a flea that hops on the back of a horse, I decided to merge my energy into your father's body. We were conjoined, our energies sewn together. And I said to him, you're a Dybbuk? And he said, call me what you like. But I stayed inside your father's body until the day he died. I was in shock. I couldn't believe this. And he shared more stories and more insight about my father and gave me clarity about my childhood after having several sessions with the spirit. At one point, I asked R.A. Kaplan, the spirit, and I said, you were there when my father was dying? And he said, yes. I said, can you tell me what he was thinking when I told him I forgave him? And the spirit said, he was angry at you. He heard you. He understood you. How dare you, he thought, bring up the word forgiveness? That is a sign of weakness. He survived the war. He watched his family murdered. He came to the United States and gave you life, and you had the chutzpah to bring up the word forgiveness? I was in shock, again, like many other sessions before, and Lee noticed I was distraught and said, Karen, are you okay? And I said, well, I thought that maybe I'm just so naive, but when someone's on their deathbed, they might have changed. And Aryeh Kaplan, the spirit, said, don't think of your father as a monster. He endured so much pain and trauma in his lifetime, more than anybody I would have known. He said, but I hope you can forgive me. I said, why would I forgive you? He said, because when I died, I had so much anger in my heart. I was angry at Hitler and the Germans and God, and I couldn't see the light. So my anger, coupled with your father's, turned him into this maniacal, volatile man. Each time I tried to pull out of his body because I didn't want to be in there, he got angrier and angrier. So please, Karen, can you forgive me? And after a few minutes, I said to Aryeh the spirit, of course I can forgive you. You did what you thought you needed to do in those dire circumstances. But I hope you can learn to forgive yourself. It was so unusual that this spirit, Aryeh Kaplan, and I formed this unlikely bond. I appreciated, I was so grateful that he had given me insight to my past, my childhood and my father's past. Each year, I light candles, Yortzeit candles, 3 times a year at the different Jewish holidays. I light a candle for my father, for my mother, for my brother, and a candle for the 6 million Jews, to remember them and to honor who they were. Since then, I now light a candle for Aryeh Kaplan, so grateful that I befriended this spirit and honored to carry on his surname, Kaplan. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Susan Merdinger, and I have with me here today Ilya Levinson, the composer, and Karen Kaplan, the author. And we are here today to talk about the Dybbuk, a Dybbuk. What is a Dybbuk? And this, the reason for us discussing this is that these 2 wonderful artists, along with myself, have all been involved in the Dybbuk, what it is, and bringing it to life, the story of a Dybbuk. First, I performed a trio by Ilya, as he has mentioned, the Dybbuk trio, and Karen has authored a memoir about a Dybbuk that inhabited her own father, a Holocaust survivor. So thank you both for being here, and I kind of will just start out by moderating and asking you both a couple of questions. And in this particular case, I think, Karen, I'll start with you, because you have experienced firsthand what a Dybbuk is. And this is a very powerful experience that you've graciously shared with us. And I have a couple more questions to ask you about it. First off, why do you think, knowing and understanding that about what a Dybbuk is important for people in society today?
Well, it's not quite often that Dybbuk will merge into a body, but it does happen. And if someone has some kind of psychological or mental disease, or they might be hearing things, or hearing voices in their head. Often it can be a medical phenomenon going on, but every once in a while it may be an entity that has attached into their body and they are following orders from this entity, voicing whatever this entity wants them to do, and they can become explosive and maniacal and not understanding what's going on in them, and this is just a possibility.
Like when people say, the devil made me do it, that sort of thing.
Yes, you
there
have
might
these-
actually be a demon inside
Right.
them.
Right. They're all of a sudden they're just a normal human being, and for some reason they go off doing shootings at schools, and the police officer will ask them, why did you do this? And they will say, the devil made me do it. They're not understanding really what's going on inside of them.
In your book, you mentioned that you discovered basically that your father was a sociopath, and yet growing up you didn't realize that. You didn't know a lot of the facts about what that meant, and yet he functioned in society. He got married, he raised a family, he provided for a family. So how did that affect you when you learned the truth about your father through your experience with the medium, with the channeling through Lee?
So when I had written my first book, and I shared all these experiences about my father and talked about him in our past, I was actually writing down a lot of characteristics of a sociopath, but I didn't put it all together. It wasn't until Lee had channeled the spirit Ari Kaplan who told me that my father was a sociopath. It's something that it was difficult to hear. It was hard to realize that, but he nailed who my father was. I couldn't figure it out. And it helped me understand more about my father, how the trauma had affected him, and actually changed who he was, because trauma affects the brain and the PTSD, and he actually, who he was before the war was, he was a different man after the trauma. So it actually gave me, it was like a diagnosis that I was waiting for a long time, and gave me clarity about who he was.
Yeah, and as I understand, his behavior is just a defense
Defense mechanism. yes.
mechanism, because he was scared that the people would find him. This is why he took Elias, the new name, and it's all defense mechanism. He probably loved you, but it was hidden way.
His heart got hardened.
Yeah.
So, is it I think it might even be possible that what Aryeh, the spirit, told you, that was his interpretation. And I think that in the time that your father lived, it was definitely a stigma to have any kind of emotional or mental weakness or illness.
Sure.
And so that further sublimated his illness and made it, even harder to hide, and it just erupted uncontrollably, obviously, from your descriptions. But I think he did his best to live with it,
Right.
without any help, without any modern science or medicine or anything. And there may have been, nowadays we have treatments for people with PTSD. We have treatments for people who have emotional mental problems, and regardless of the derivation of it, whether it's from a true Dybbuk, and if you believe in that and you feel that that's what it could be, then certainly the path that you took to discover, and in discovering about this, led you to be a believer in the Dybbuk. Now, Ilya, you've expressed that you're slightly skeptical about what a Dybbuk is. So I'd like to understand your perspective. What makes you skeptical about it, and yet what makes it so enticing and attractive of a belief system
Right.
for you? Like, what do you
I think
feel?
that our psyche, our brain is so huge and enormous that it has everything. So everything what happens is a product of our psyche. Now, it doesn't mean that the outside world doesn't exist. It exists, but it reflects and percolates and transforms inside us in a various ways that we only now starting to understand. But it's interesting that in my life I am coming in touch with spiritual matters that tell me otherwise. So maybe I will be changing my perspective on things. I'm not denying it. It's I have different experiences in life, and I think almost everyone knows someone who is a psychopath in their life, but we don't really know what they are. And it was really great to read in your book, and you write very clear and very understandable how to unravel and how to understand who this person is. And it's very hard because it's your father.
Right.
It's your closest person in your life. That's
Right. Belief in the paranormal is rising.
right. Absolutely.
25 years ago, you couldn't go into a bookstore and see shelves and a whole aisle full of spiritual books.
Right.
So it is rising, but so is the need for healing.
Yeah.
And if this book is an unusual way to show healing, then if this book can help others, then I'm just feeling good that it may bring light to other people.
Absolutely.
Well, what I would like to discuss for a moment is how the music can enhance the understanding of the Dybbuk story in the case of the movie, or can potentially enhance the emotions that we feel when we read such a book, which we hope may become a movie or a play. What I noticed in performing these various pieces by Beethoven, by you, Ilya, by William Bolcom, what I noticed was that there's certain elements there's certain commonalities. And one of them is this sort of misty kind of sound, a lot of blurring of sound.
Yeah.
And that's because that realm between life and death is so blurry. And I'd just like to tell a little story. When my father was dying in the hospital, his heart stopped 3 times and restarted. And he was having a hard time letting go because he fought through a terrible, terrible disease, leukemia, acute lymphocytic leukemia, and he was young still. And he was lying there in the same way your dad was, bloated with and covered with contusions from various IVs and ports, and about 20 months of struggling with just a devastating illness. And I wish we could have exorcised that leukemia. I wish that could have been like a Dybbuk that we could have exorcised, because sometimes an illness can be a force of evil. You wonder where it comes from. But on his deathbed, my father shed a single tear down one cheek. We were telling him how much we loved him, and I'll never forget that experience. But it was about 2 weeks later that I had a very powerful dream. And you mentioned a dream in your book, and I wanted to share my dream because after reading about your dream and how you said that spirits can come to us in our dreams, it made my experience, it validated it. After my father died, there were a couple of signs that his spirit was still with us. right after he died, but before his funeral, and we were in our home. My father was a great lover of animals and all kind of nature, and he had once rescued a deer that had been impaled on an iron fence in our neighborhood, and he lifted it off. And later on, my mother and I had seen that deer who was a doe. She was limping along, but had in trail several small baby fawns with her. So he saved the life of a deer that went on to procreate. On the day that my father died, an entire herd of deer appeared on the lawn, on the backyard of my mother's house. Usually we would see deer in groups of 1 or 2, maybe 3. We never saw a herd of like 20 deer. And they all were sitting there, lying down on the lawn, grazing. And that was after my father died. Not only that, he once saved a bird. They was on the beach. This was a story, true story, in Florida, where a heron had swallowed a fishing hook in its throat. And it was stuck in his throat, and the bird was struggling. And my father, having been a salesman, a sailor, and a fisherman, not by profession, this was his one of his joys and pastimes, he immediately on the beach grabbed the bird by the throat, pushed the fishing hook through the throat, snipped it off, removed it, and set the bird free. And when my father died, birds came. They came into the garage. They were all over. It was so weird because I feel like his connection with the animal world was very strong. He grew up with a German Shepherd. He grew up. He had asthma, so his parents sent him to Arizona, where he had a pet donkey and chickens, and he had lots of pets. So that was one of the signs. And now, after he died, and I would be walking around here in Highland Park, every time I went for a walk, a deer would cross right in front of my path. And I always had this sense that he was riding on the back of that deer. But here's where the interesting thing happened, that when I had this dream, the dream was so vivid, and it drew from an experience we had going to Navy Pier as a family when my parents were visiting us here. And in this particular dream, it was not like any experience we had. We went to that Ferris wheel on several occasions, went with my parents, with the kids, and in the dream, we were all online. And you know how they stop you and they let a few people on, and then they stop you and you have to wait for the next little car to come. Well, we were going through the line, and my father got on, and we were right behind him, but boom, the door shut, and they said, nope, no more room. And he got on that Ferris wheel, and I was screaming. I was saying, wait a minute, we're all together. We're supposed to be on that we're supposed to be in that car together. We're a family. We're supposed to be together. And they said, no more room. It's not your time. It's not your time. And my father was on the Ferris wheel waving goodbye. And I remember we were just really distraught that we weren't going on that Ferris wheel. And I saw that Ferris wheel the way I interpreted this dream. That Ferris wheel was representing the circle of life. And the guard, the attendant who said, it's not your time, he was saying to us who were still alive, it's not our time to ascend on that part of the circle of life. And I saw my father saying to me from behind the bars in this car, in the Ferris wheel, it's okay, I'm fine, I'm gonna be great, and that for me was a very healing dream. It was finally allowed me to accept it.
Often, when someone dies close to them, whether it be a father, a parent, or even a friend, that is the way the spirit world can connect to people on earth, is through dreams. You're sleeping, you've let down the whole mental part of your brain, let down the rational part, and they can come through into a dream.
It was so real. I thought I was awake. That's how it felt, and I thought I was seeing my father for real, and he was saying it was okay, and he reached out his hand and he waved, and I couldn't believe the power of that dream. From that moment on, I was healed, and I spent the rest of that year trying to heal my mom after losing her husband of 45 years, and the rest of my family. We probably, there's always a part of you that doesn't recover, but 99.999% of you has to go on, and you have to learn how to get over what is a very natural part of life. Death is a part of life. And in my Jewish upbringing, I was just taught that there was no afterlife. So, in reading a book like this and knowing that it is compatible and it can work with no matter what your religious beliefs are. If a belief system gives you solace, if it gives you peace, if it helps you heal, there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's a beautiful thing, A couple of questions now about the music, Ilya. I'd like to know where do you derive your inspiration to come up with the sounds that convey the emotions that were in this movie, and or any any piece of music that you compose. In terms of your compositional process, are sounds for you like colors are for an artist? Shapes and colors are like what
you're
sounds and the
asking
frequencies?
about you're asking about composer's kitchen. It's called how the music is made.
Mm-hmm.
So I recently heard a talk between the brain scientist and the musician, and it's on YouTube. And what I learned from it, and it actually was very interesting, that the initial idea, melodic idea, for example, so exists in the realm of sounds, frequencies.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to the brain of a composer, it stops being the realm of sounds and becomes something else.
Mm-hmm.
And I can compare it, for example, at the band rehearsal. Yes, someone comes, there's a guitar, there are drums, there's a bass, there's a solo instruments, and someone comes, okay, I have this great musical idea, and he or she, they play it on their respective instruments, and the bass player, okay, I can have a great bass to it, and drummer say, okay, there's this groove, let's try this groove, and guitar player said, okay, there's a chord progression that I can hear. So now this has happened in a band in a real time, but in a composer's head, this is what also happens, but instead of the bass player and the drummer and the guitar player and the keyboard player, there's a contrapoint, there's a harmony, there's a rhythm. This is everything what composers study, because there's lots of people who have symphonies in their heads on the street, but they don't know how to. I mean, this is the idea should fall into fertile ground, and this is what we learn. We analyze pieces by great composers, pieces that were done before us that we like, and we try to understand those pieces, and we take from them something that becomes a drummer in our imaginary rehearsal room inside our head. So, because the idea can come from the like in the trio, it opens with musical picture of the old synagogue with the flickering candles, and Chonen is praying. So, and this is the initial glissando, and well, you need to have some kind of melodic and rhythmic idea to work with and to transform. So once you do it, it becomes composer's kitchen. Cutting, adding a little bit of salt, a little bit of pepper, cumin.
Do you ever feel like you have some kind of divine inspiration where it comes to you, like something pops into your head? I got this like
Okay,
a light bulb goes off.
Yes,
and it's where did this idea come
I can say yes, and I can become a world famous composer explaining the light bulb goes in my head. No, unfortunately, no.
So your composing is a combination of inspiration.
Yes, I mean, inspiration
and
is short-lived.
yes.
Beethoven got pa 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 pa, and the heavenly light closed. What's next? Yes, and when he spent I don't know how many hours in writing in his sketchbook, transforming the theme, and so this is what is happening with me. I have this idea, and after, if it lasts for I don't know 5-10 minutes, very draining. I'm just writing, and I'm very tired. And after it stops, and you need to really have some quiet time trying to recreate this moment
And process it.
and process it, and
That's why
after.
like Beethoven had sketchbooks.
Yes,
And that's why-
absolutely, and there is tons of paper or tons of computer files now that exist that represents different stages how the musical material is developed. But for me, what was helpful, because I already had musical material written for the play, I also wrote a klezmer fugue that shows how everything is intertangled in this story, because as it turns out, Leah and Chonen are children of two best friends, Papa Sander and his friend Ben Rivke, who died. But before, when the young people, they made a pact that if one of them has a daughter and another one has son, the children will get married. And this is what happens on the other side. When
So you have to be careful what you say.
what you say, what you
think.
promise. Yes,
Yes.
absolutely.
Now I have a question.
Absolutely.
I'd like to pursue a little bit more in depth what you describe in your book about your home invasion. Do you feel, so when I was reading the book, I thought like in a certain way this home invasion might have somehow had connection to what you later discovered about the Dybbuk, in that could it have been like history repeating itself, in that you were experiencing through no reason or rationale why you had people invade your home, but somehow there was somehow maybe the spirits or whomever is up there saw fit to have this experience happen to you,
History repeats
to
itself.
have an invasion and a violation so that you might feel more empathy for what your father went through when you learned the full extent of it. Do you think that in reflecting back that this experience, which was horrific for you to go through, do you feel that you handled it better because of your perspective about what your father went through in the Holocaust, and the fact that you went on to overcome that trauma, and your children did too? They were witness to it and part of it. Tell us a little bit more about what you were thinking in the years after. How do you reflect about that whole home invasion now? Do you see it
So
related
as I
to your
mentioned
dad?
in the talk, that my father's Holocaust began with the home invasion.
Right.
So the men came into his
Yes.
home, but he held on to that trauma and the pain for all those years. Now, 70 years later, his daughter has a
one.
home invasion. So I am challenged. Am I going to hold on to this pain? See, for me, it was forgiving my father on his bedside was difficult, but I knew he couldn't hurt me any longer. But what if, this is what I was thinking about before the home invasion, that's why I said be careful what you think before, is that what if someone would dare hurt my children? Would I be able to forgive them?
Right.
And just a couple months later, I had a home
Wow.
invasion
Right.
where my children both had guns to their head and my son was tied up and I was tied up. And so do I want to continue to follow in my father's footsteps and hold on to this anger toward these men? I certainly didn't know if they were going to be caught. My father never knew if those men were caught. I certainly didn't want to live in fear, but I had to move out of my home immediately. And so it took me a good 6 months to finally let this go, let it go.
What did your
and
father
forgive.
think of it? He was alive then. What
No, my father was not alive.
if- oh, he wasn't.
He wasn't alive
Okay.
at that moment.
Okay.
But I was always since the home invasion, I was just like he was in some ways paranoid about. I was always nervous about who to let inside my home after that. And then when I had the session with Lee and conjuring up a debate, I'm like, who am I going to let inside my, my space? I want to be
Yes.
careful. I just don't allow anybody in my house today. And Lee always made sure she did a prayer of protection. I don't need any evil spirit coming in and
Yeah.
creating chaos in my life. So I try to be careful, not to be fearful. But I think it was a test for me to see how I can move forward.
That's pretty
Yes.
brutal test.
Yeah.
It was really, I mean, that part of the story was, I think also had tremendous value to your audiences because you suffered a trauma that was actually completely unrelated to your father, and you had to overcome that. It had no relationship, nobody died. It was still nonetheless a situation of really unfathomable fear and certainly you must have felt very violated and angry at these perpetrators.
I had PTSD
Yes,
from that,
yes.
if you can call that. But I
Yes.
was, paranoid, traumatized.
I would definitely
Yes.
think so. It's really a real strong testament to you, to your strength, that you were raised in a situation where you had a father, abusive as he was, and volatile, and really inexplainable under, at the time, you didn't have any other explanation for why your father would be that way. So that must have been very difficult as a young child. But you overcame him because of the other benevolent forces in your life, namely your mother. And I think that also is one of the most beautiful aspects that you describe in this book is your mother, and how blessed you were to have such a special mother who you claim you wanted to, she really suffered under, being married to your father. But perhaps she sensed that was her purpose, to absorb the suffering and create warmth and a household, a family for her children, so that you would grow up fine. You would overcome the effects that your father might have had on you because of her completely opposite nature, her ability to filter all the negative and create warmth and beauty in your life, bringing music.
She had unconditional love. So bottom line is that she loved me for who I was. She was my role model. And though she was a battered woman and endured the abuse from my father, she showed me what unconditional love is, and she tried to protect us and help us. And when I became an adult, I wanted to help her. I wanted her to leave my father because she deserved more,
But she wouldn't.
but she wouldn't.
She
I
wouldn't.
mean, she was a
So-
force of balance in
Yeah.
this situation, on the other side of the spectrum.
But she showed me unconditional love, and from that I was able to move forward and provide that love for my children
Yeah.
and
And for your father.
myself and
And
for people around me.
You have demonstrated that you can change the cycle of abuse. Because very often people who are abusers
Yeah, because
have parents or family members that have
Right.
abused them
Yeah.
first.
Right.
And or people who have witnessed abuse, and this is something that is learned. It's experiential, it's environmental, and it also can be spiritual, emotional, inhabited from a Dibbuk that you don't know about or have any control. But you have demonstrated how you were able to take the forces of good and from your mom, you got all the benevolent good things from your mom, and you were finally able to shake the negative from your father, and all of those elements and qualities through your own spiritual search and soul searching, and also your own experiences. I think. Do you feel that after your own home invasion that led to more empathy for perhaps how your father felt during the Holocaust?
Well, I finally understood what being paranoid was.
Right.
Yes,
because
okay.
That, and I understood what it was like being traumatized.
But we don't ever want to have to experience
No,
the same things.
No,
That
but
shouldn't be a way that you learn.
unfortunately,
In your
I
case,
had felt that, and
I mean, was it necessary?
trauma also lingers. The effects linger from generation after generation. So if we had sent our soldiers to war, their family and their children will be affected by what that soldier endured.
Or-
Whether you're the perpetrator or whether you're the victim of the war, you both endured pain and suffering,
Absolutely.
and that lingers on.
Absolutely.
So I'm hoping that I made some slight difference and stopped that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
I think
effect.
what your book really is just emphasizing how you can take fear, you can take anger, you can take hate, you can take all these emotions, and you can resolve them through work and soulful introspection and a strong desire, because you don't have to live your life in pain, you don't have to live your life in fear. And I think the sad thing is that your father, because of when he was living and how much of a taboo there was for emotional and mental health issues,
They were doing shock therapy at the time.
Right.
So
Yeah.
who wants to admit that they need help or
Right. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The man should be tough.
right?
yeah,
right.
that's
Hold
the other
everything.
thing.
But I wrote this book because there's so many of us who have experienced trauma or challenging situations in their life.
Oh, almost
But-
everyone.
right. So whether you were a child and have felt neglected or unloved by a parent, abused by a friend, a relative, or even harassed at work, we've all had challenging circumstances, and we don't have to live in the pain of our past. And there are options, and I just share my one way of
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
able to heal.
It's
Yeah.
kind of putting closure
Yeah.
on the very complex.
I have one
Story.
more question. I'd like you, you mentioned very briefly some of the signs of a Dybbuk that you can see in a person if you know what to look for. So would you like to share that with us?
Well, what I learned from Lee, my spiritual teacher, and I'm forever indebted to her. But when someone is for example, like a drug addict or an alcoholic, their whole systems are you can easily penetrate, easy permeable.
Corruptible.
Right? It's as if you're in a classroom with all these 25 children The children who have weak immune systems, they all breathe in the same virus, but those children who are weakened are more likely to get sick. And it's the same thing with your spiritual and your physical and your mental. If you've weakened, then your whole auric field, your energy is weakened as well. And if there's a Dybbuk roaming around,
There are plenty.
and sees somebody's weakened,
Yeah.
they may inhabit the body.
Absolutely.
And when they do, often you will hear sounds or you'll hear noises and voices in your head and not understand what is actually going on. And that's what happened to my father. He thought he was going mad because he kept hearing this
Yeah.
Dybbuk Ari Kaplan talk to him and actually tell him, stop beating your wife.
Oh my God.
And so you hear noises. You also have lots of, I was told, bruises on your body that you don't know where they came from. And you have certain diseases that you just can't pinpoint why you have, like, for example, fibromyalgia. It's just, and so with having all these different personalities, and if you may not have been a alcoholic or a drug addict, but you may have been traumatized as a child, and as a result from that trauma, it is easily able for a Dybbuk to enter in.
Do you think that like drug and alcohol use is an effect, like a side effect of potentially having a Dybbuk? Like, do you think people turn to that to calm themselves and try to ease the pain of what they're feeling of perhaps this inhabitant of a Dybbuk?
Well,
What do you think?
I lived in Soviet Union, in Moscow, in front of the factory, and people who just have very little in their life, they go to work, and after they drink, they split half a liter of vodka in 3 parts, and they're drunk, and they come, they try to get out of the hopeless life.
Yeah.
Because there is nothing. It's I think you need to have a will to live and will to have some pleasure in life. It's very easy. It's very easy to drink alcohol and wake up next morning and go to do work. And after, what to do? I just get drunk and I sleep and I go to work, and after I get drunk.
So
It's
it's a
shutting
way
down.
of self-medicating
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
trying to remove yourself from
Right.
the pain of your situation. And it might even be the Dybbuk that compels a person to turn to these other sources of.
Or it may be their childhood and growing up in a home or enduring something in their life, and we'll never know.
Yeah. Well, we'll definitely never know. Well, I'm just thinking that I don't know if I've touched on everything that I wanted to discuss, but I think that it's safe to say that if you want to prevent a Dybbuk from overtaking you, you must be strong, both physically and mentally. And I think you have to do everything in your power to try to find meaning and purpose in your life, and that will bring some kind of satisfaction and mental strength in everything that you do. I feel like sometimes people can just feel like they're lost and they don't know what they're supposed to be doing in their life, and that in itself can be a weakness, but yet it's a very normal part of growing up and maturing for young people. Your father was so young when this happened, and we send our young people off to war. They're conscripted at the age of 18, when they're still the prefrontal cortex in a young man is not fully formed to the age of 25. So a lot of their experiences, if they go into the army and they have traumatic experience there, for example, this becomes indelibly imprinted in their brain, and it takes a lot of modern science, psychotherapy, treatments to overcome it. And I think it's just a beautiful story that you've shared with us with your novel, and I really encourage everyone to read Conjoined, and it's available. Tell us where it's available.
You can buy it on Amazon and on Amazon Kindle,
And I look forward to making a professional recording of the Dybbuk Piano Trio. So you will eventually be able to listen to this beautiful piece and enjoy it in a professional recording, but at least enjoy some of the live recordings that we are able to share with you of this brand new piece composed in 2021, I guess was its premiere.
In March.
In March. And what I think is so special is that we've just been going through a trauma of our own with this pandemic that is affecting the entire world. And so in a sense, your book comes at a very timely it's very timely in that our entire world is hurting and suffering from loss. Certainly many people have died, and economic loss and social and emotional loss that we're all facing as a world, and not a particularly united and unified one at that. So I believe that this book is going to be very helpful. So thank you, Karen. And I believe that the music that you've written, Ilya, just like Karen's book brought a tear to my eyes, so does your music. And I'm really, really always thrilled and delighted to perform it. So thank you both.
Thank you, sir.
It's
Thank
just
you very
delightful to collaborate with both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching and listening.